let's see. All right, I'll try to get started here. Presentation is about 10 minutes, so we should have time for questions at the end. But here we go. All right. So throughout history, we have been captivated by the concept of the ruin and ways of reflecting on the past. Yet today's status of ruin is different, as all of society during the Anthropocene could be considered already in a state of ruin. Realizing this, I believe there to be a new emerging attitude towards ruins today, one that addresses a more direct appreciation of a ruin's aesthetic and overall qualities of spatial ambiguity. This phenomenon of ruins as a new aesthetic, I believe, can be seen in a number of recent works, particularly on the right by architect David Adjaye. A project by the name of Mole House portrays its importance as an example of the motif, not simply because of its story, but rather its attention to ruined aesthetic and how these moments of surface detail begin to completely change how the project is perceived. Like this, with the image on the left from a project titled Antevilla, architects Brandlhumer and Emde actively took hammers to the walls in order to replicate the appearance of World War II building decay, all for the purpose of spatial aestheticism. Now you might be thinking to yourself that there's something a little strange with the replication of uncomfortable real-world experiences for simply the sake of personal enjoyment. And you would be right. It is exactly this discomfort and the aesthetic that created it that I'm interested in understanding and developing. In order to identify this phenomena with ruined aesthetic, it requires the viewer to morally question themselves and the objects that are observed. Inevitably, not everyone is going to be comfortable with accepting such a blatant disregard for context. But in contrast to this, we also can't strictly say some people wouldn't enjoy the almost fetishized dark fascination with what's considered uncomfortable. After all, why is it that so many ruin porn or urban explorer accounts exist all over social media, if not to profit from these very emotions? Once the phenomena can consciously be acknowledged, I believe that as architects and creative individuals, it is then important to create a dialogue around this topic and its place within the discipline. Particularly with this thesis, I hope that through how I can aestheticize my own representation of ruin, both in terms of its objective qualities of the elements as objects and the subjective qualities of their experiences, that some degree of this very dialogue in question is discussed. In terms of the objective aspect of the project that I am designing, I have taken an existing ruin of an old bathhouse in West Virginia. Displayed here are photographs of the site and of a rough digital model created from in-person survey drawings showing the volumes of spaces that once existed and the volumes that still remain. In terms of my approach to the site, I am not interested in program or even really history, but only in its ghostly missing volumes and the matter that results from their decay. I focused on ruination in terms of both the decaying volumes and the physical matter of the decay itself. And so in turn, I became interested in the possibilities of Gabion-like cages, both to evoke the outline of former volumes and to hold or rehouse decaying matter. As exploration at different scales of the cage continued, it became a key architectural element that I was able to insert into the site. The mesh of the cage then acts as both figuring ghostly outlines of the volumes, some old, some new, as well as working structurally to give new form to the rubble and debris as their matter that infills them. When volume is then paired with the treatment of the material, a relationship between these two displays a clear correlation of the power of human agency and existing condition. A final thing that interests me about the objective dimension of my project, and which further illustrates what I mean by aestheticization, are these early experiments with how to create the effects of ruin. These textures on the left are not, as you might think, traces or casts of the ruins that appear in the photographs next to them, but rather completely fabricated at my desk. I'm interested in the way that we can create ruin aesthetics without them being indexically concerned with tracing an authentic original. I'm also interested in the possibilities of aesthetic manipulation and exaggeration that exists when one rejects the indexical and the relationship to the authentic. From these interests, how I was able to use these types of surface treatments in ways that communicated with the deployed cages ended up resulting in thin, almost wallpaper and skin-like layers, thus echoing the thematic staging effects of elements throughout the site. Which brings me to my interest in working more explicitly with how the project is subjectively experienced. I have taken an interest in more staged scenes that heighten a sense of mood and atmosphere, thereby creating experiences of each element devoid of context, only reliant on the architecture of the individual scene. For example, I looked to learning from photography and film precedents such as the work of James Casimir and the film Hereditary by Ari Aster. By drawing upon techniques in architectural model photography and film, both works show a self-reflexivity about the framing of the scene as the camera moves in and out of their models. If you will, an architecture almost entirely focused on scene. From this, I've been attempting to apply both facets together through a series of renderings driven specifically by the architecture and the various characters of each scene. Particularly for these renderings, I have applied the traditional film aspect ratio of 4:3, creating moments or film stills, if you will, that each express a differing variety of aesthetic depending on the artifice of the architectural elements and their immediate context. For the sake of the presentation, I've pulled out just a couple of the elements in hopes that I can elaborate on some of the narrative and meaning that is developed from application of the scenographic process to each. With this element, I wanted to show a degree of intervention into part of the existing remnant of the ruin on site. To do this, the cage element acts as almost a lifeline for the wall, theoretically keeping it upright until it too inevitably fails, thus changing the ruin's life cycle once again. By making the caged element also a point of transition upon the site, it becomes the subject, sorry, I lost my place. By making the caged element also a point of transition upon the site, it allows the subject to engage with the literal nature of inhabiting a space that once existed, now in an entirely different, yet somehow familiar way. The highlighting of the joint where cage meets ruin creates a constant reminder of the service that the cage is providing, and also the evergreen notion of human agency, refusing to let the ruin die. With this particular element, I wanted to show what it might be like if the once inhabitants / caretakers of this place willingly chose to not take care of their natural water spring, and in essence end up poisoning the water. By framing one of the fallen gates from the main entrance of the existing building, the cage in this sense acts as a sort of willful negligence in that it essentially places the destruction of the ruin on a pedestal for all to see. As the trash and foreign objects begin to pile up around the cage, you begin to wonder if the inhabitants even know why someone went all this trouble to frame this piece of the site's history. With this last element that I'll share, I wanted to take the cage in a way that doesn't directly affect the changing status of the ruin, but rather one that sees the cage itself acting as its own ruin affected by its surroundings. In a mockingly direct sense of the arch structure on the front of the actual ruin, this cage resembles the ruin, but it is removed from the direct relationship to it. In this separated location, we see the cage in a state of deterioration after a tree has fallen on it, thus indefinitely changing the composition and amplifying its own ruination. To conclude, I have said there are two parts to my thesis. One objective concerned with the ruin, an architectural project to intervene and to focus on volume and matter, and the other subjective, concerned with how we experience the object via modes of representation that help develop the overall aesthetic of space. Through exploring these two aspects of my thesis, I have been attempting to highlight a shared common sensibility of embracing ruins because of their aesthetic effects without being tied to them as sources of authenticity. As stated before, I see this new aesthetic emerging in the world around us, and I argue that it's connected to how we define the Anthropocene, and in turn then the overwhelming sense of dread, either for better or for worse, that comes from the realization of our whole world already in a state of ruin. But by trying to understand it, and by working with it, I believe new facets of how we treat the existing condition around us will lead to new and encouraging developments within our discipline and with ultimately how we live our lives. And that is where I'll stop. So the floor is open.